At his stepfather's will reading in the small town of Blue Cedar, the entire family took the money and the fortune, leaving a Navy SEAL and his German shepherd with nothing but an abandoned estate. The whole room laughed, believing the soldier had lost everything. But when he and his loyal dog finally arrived at Aurora House, they quickly realized the place was far from worthless. Strange signs inside the greenhouse, a hidden passage beneath the ground, and secrets buried for many years. It was as if the person who left the estate already knew that one day the Navy SEAL and his dog would return. And from that moment on, the inheritance was no longer just an abandoned property. It became a mission that had to be protected. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 followers so we can keep creating more meaningful stories. Now let's begin the story. The morning light over Lake Superior arrived slowly, like a careful hand lifting a curtain. Callan Voss stood at the far end of the wooden pier outside the Blue Cedar Community Hall, watching the pale sun spread across the water. The lake looked endless from here, steel blue and calm, stretching into a horizon that felt older than memory. It was the kind of quiet beauty that usually made people feel small in a peaceful way. Today, it only made him feel alone. A cold wind rolled down from the northern cliffs and brushed across his face. It caught in the collar of the old olive-gray tactical combat shirt he wore and tugged lightly at the fabric, faded and softened by years of use. The shirt had once been stiff and dark when it came out of a military supply crate. Now the cuffs were slightly frayed, the shoulders worn pale by sun and washing. Underneath it, the deep red thermal layer showed faintly at the collar. Callan barely noticed the cold. He had stood in worse weather in worse places. 35 years old, about 6 feet tall, with a lean strength that came from training rather than vanity, Callan carried himself with the quiet balance of someone who had learned to stay alive under pressure. His face was clean-shaven, his jaw square and defined, the sharp lines of his cheekbones catching the thin northern sunlight. His hair dark brown, cut in a military style, just slightly longer than regulation shifted in the wind. But it was his eyes people noticed first. Gray-blue, steady. The kind of eyes that suggested a man who had seen enough of the world that very little surprised him anymore. At least, that was what strangers thought. Inside the hall behind him, voices murmured and chairs scraped against wooden floors. The town gathering was about to begin. Callan rested his hand absently against the thick fur beside him. "Easy, Merritt." The German shepherd sitting at his side flicked one ear in response. Meridian, called Merritt, was 6 years old and built like a perfect example of the breed-strong but streamlined. His coat shifted between cream, gray, and deep black, darker along the spine and lighter along the chest. The dog's amber eyes held a focused intelligence that made people uneasy until they realized the gaze wasn't aggressive. It was observant. Merritt wore a black working harness with subtle dark red trim, a design used for search and rescue and field work. The harness was scuffed from use but clean, maintained with the same quiet discipline Callan gave to everything he owned. The dog's tail rested calmly against the pier boards, but his posture was alert. Merritt had always been able to sense when something was wrong before Callan did. Today, the dog had been watching the building behind them since they arrived. Callan followed the dog's gaze briefly, then exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he murmured quietly. "I know." Inside that building waited the kind of fight he hated most: family. The Blue Cedar Community Hall was a modest building, white-painted wood with wide windows facing the lake. The place had served as town meeting room, school auditorium, and winter storm shelter for nearly a century. Today, it held a different purpose. Inheritance. Callan stepped inside with Merritt at his side. The room quieted. It happened in a subtle wave, conversation stopping mid-sentence, heads turning, eyes measuring. Blue Cedar was a small northern town. Outsiders were noticed. Returning sons were remembered. And Callan had left many years ago. A woman near the front whispered something to the man beside her. Another man gave Callan a brief nod of recognition. Some faces were curious. Some were cautious. One was openly hostile. That face belonged to Rhett Halbrook. Rhett stood near the front row beside a tall woman dressed in a tailored camel coat. Rhett was in his late 30s, about Callan's age, but the resemblance between them ended there. Where Callan's strength came from years of real hardship, Rhett carried the polished confidence of someone who had always lived comfortably. He was tall, slightly taller than Callan, and broad-shouldered in a way that suggested a carefully maintained gym routine rather than labor. His light brown hair was styled neatly, his jaw smooth, his posture relaxed with the easy arrogance of a man used to being admired. He wore a dark pea coat over expensive winter clothing. His smile was pleasant. His eyes were not. The woman beside him, Marlene Halbrook, watched the room with the calm control of someone who had ruled family gatherings for decades. She was in her early 60s, slender, elegant, her silver blonde hair arranged neatly at the nape of her neck. Her face was refined and composed, but the thinness of her lips gave her expressions a sharp edge. She noticed Callan immediately. Her gaze flicked once to the dog, then back to Callan. Marlene's voice, when she spoke, was quiet but precise. "So you did come." Callan didn't answer. Merritt sat. The lawyer at the front cleared his throat. The reading began. The will belonged to Harold Halbrook, Callan's stepfather, the man who had raised him after his mother died, the man whose approval Callan had once chased across half the world. The lawyer read through property lists and land holdings, speaking in a neutral tone that made everything sound simple. The shipyard on the southern dock, the Halbrook Marina, 3 waterfront houses, investment funds, ownership transferred to Rhett Halbrook. Callan remained still. He had expected something like this. Rhett leaned back slightly in his chair, one ankle resting across his knee. "Funny thing about family," Rhett said quietly, loud enough for Callan to hear. "You have to actually stay part of it." Callan kept his eyes forward. The lawyer turned another page. "And to Callan Voss." A pause. No one in the room breathed. "No direct inheritance has been designated." The words landed gently, but they cut deep. Callan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the one that came when something inside him finally accepted what it had always suspected. Rhett gave a soft chuckle. Marlene did not look surprised. Callan stood slowly. His boots sounded heavy on the wooden floor. Merritt rose with him instantly. Callan did not look at anyone as he walked toward the exit. He had faced gunfire overseas, but humiliation had a different weight. Outside, the wind had grown stronger. Snow clouds gathered far over the northern water, though sunlight still broke through the edges. Callan stepped down onto the gravel path beside the pier. Merritt followed. For a long moment, neither moved. Then a voice called from behind them. "Mr. Voss?" Callan turned. A small elderly woman approached carefully across the gravel. She was in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, with short silver hair and thin wire-frame glasses. Her posture was slightly stooped, but her eyes were bright and intelligent. This was Irene Bell, the town librarian. Everyone in Blue Cedar knew Irene. She had worked in the small library for 40 years and possessed the rare ability to remember not just books, but people. "Callan Voss," she said gently. Her voice carried warmth rather than judgment. Callan nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." Irene studied him for a moment. Her gaze shifted briefly to Merritt. The dog tilted his head slightly, curious. "You've grown," she said quietly. Then she reached into her bag and removed a sealed envelope. Deep blue wax marked the fold. Your name was written across the front, in careful handwriting. To be delivered to Callan Voss upon the reading of Harold Halbrook's estate. Callan frowned. "Who sent it?" Irene answered softly. "Seren Vale." Callan's heart skipped once. Seren Vale. The name felt distant but familiar. His mother's sister. The woman the family had stopped talking about decades ago. Before Callan could open the envelope, Merritt suddenly stiffened. The German shepherd's ears lifted sharply. His nose rose into the wind. Then the dog stepped closer to the envelope in Irene's hand and sniffed it carefully. Once. Twice. And then, unexpectedly, Merritt sat down and looked directly at Callan. Not like a dog waiting for a command, like a soldier waiting for a decision. Callan felt a strange chill run through him. "Merritt?" The dog held his gaze, as if he already knew what was inside. Callan broke the wax seal. The letter inside was written on thick, cream-colored paper. The handwriting was precise and steady. "My dear Callan, if you are reading this, then the Halbrooks have done exactly what I expected. They always believed blood meant ownership. They were wrong. I have left you something of my own, not because you are family, but because you are the only one who understands how to carry what others abandon. The property known as Aurora House now belongs to you. You will find it north of Blue Cedar, beyond the cliffs where the pine forest meets the water. The house is old. The truth inside it is older. Trust the dog. He will understand before you do. Seren Vale." Callan read the letter twice. The wind rustled through the pine trees behind the pier. Irene watched quietly. "Well?" she asked gently. Callan folded the letter slowly. "A house," he said. Merritt wagged his tail once. The first time all morning. Callan looked down at the dog. "You ready for another mission?" Merritt stood. The lake wind carried the scent of cold water and distant forests. And somewhere beyond the cliffs of Blue Cedar, a forgotten house waited. Callan opened the truck door. Merritt jumped inside. The engine turned over. And for the first time that day, Callan felt something he hadn't felt since walking into that hall. Possibility. The road north of Blue Cedar curved along the cliffs like a ribbon of pale gravel pressed against the edge of Lake Superior. Callan Voss drove with both hands steady on the wheel of his old pickup, the engine humming in a low mechanical rhythm that matched the slow movement of the morning clouds overhead. The lake stretched out to his right, vast and silver blue beneath the soft light of late morning. Pine forests climbed the rocky hills to his left, their dark green tops swaying gently in the wind. The farther he drove, the quieter the world became. Blue Cedar disappeared behind him within minutes, replaced by long stretches of shoreline where no houses stood, and no roads branched away. Only gulls wheeling above the water and the occasional cry of a distant hawk broke the silence. Merritt sat upright in the passenger seat, alert but calm. The German shepherd's amber eyes watched the passing landscape with focused attention, as if he were studying the territory rather than simply riding through it. Callan glanced at the dog briefly. "You look like you've been here before," he muttered. Merritt flicked an ear, but didn't move. Callan returned his gaze to the road. The letter from Seren Vale rested in the inside pocket of his jacket, folded neatly against his chest. He had read it again before leaving town, searching the words for anything hidden between the lines. There wasn't much, just a location. Aurora House. And the strange instruction that still lingered in his mind like an unfinished sentence. Trust the dog. Callan had trusted Merritt with his life before. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. It was inheritance. And family. Neither had ever been simple. 20 minutes later, the gravel road narrowed and turned into a thin dirt path that disappeared into the trees. A weathered wooden sign leaned slightly beside the entrance. The paint had faded over the years, but the letters were still readable. Aurora House, private property. Callan slowed the truck and rolled forward carefully. Tall red pines lined the drive, their trunks rising like pillars on either side of the path. The ground beneath them was soft with old needles, and shafts of sunlight filtered down in warm, golden streaks. The air smelled different here. Cooler, cleaner, like stone and water and growing things. Callan drove another quarter-mile before the trees opened suddenly. Aurora House stood on a gentle rise above the lake. For a long moment, Callan simply stared. It wasn't the crumbling mansion he had imagined when he first heard the word estate. It was something stranger, and somehow more alive. The main house was built from pale northern stone, 2 stories tall with large windows facing the water. Weather had softened the edges of the structure over time, but the building still carried the quiet strength of something carefully designed. To the right stood a long glass greenhouse, its curved roof glittering in the sunlight. Vines crept along its outer frame, and the faint outline of plants could be seen growing inside. Behind the house rose a tall metal structure. A wind observation tower, its thin steel frame stretching above the trees. Apple trees filled the slope between the greenhouse and the cliffside. Their branches were heavy with small green fruit that would ripen later in the summer. Callan shut off the engine. Silence settled over the property. Even the wind seemed to pause. "Well," he said quietly. Merritt jumped down from the truck first. The German Shepherd landed lightly on the gravel, then stood perfectly still. His ears rose, his nose lifted toward the breeze. Callan watched the dog closely. Merritt turned slowly in a circle, scanning the property. Not nervous, not aggressive, just attentive. Like a soldier stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Callan stepped out and stretched his shoulders. The place felt strange, not abandoned, more like it had been waiting. The front door opened easily when he tried it. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of old wood and dry leaves. Sunlight poured through tall windows and spilled across the wooden floorboards in warm rectangles. Callan stepped inside cautiously. Merritt followed. The house was simple, but beautiful. The main room was wide and open, with a stone fireplace built into the far wall. Shelves lined the room, filled with books, maps, and old journals. The furniture was sturdy and practical rather than decorative oak tables, woven chairs, a long workbench near the window. Callan ran his fingers across the surface of the table. Dust lifted slightly beneath his touch, but not much. Someone had kept the place clean until recently. Merritt padded across the room slowly, sniffing the corners and edges of the floor. Callan walked toward a large wooden desk near the back wall. Papers lay stacked neatly beside a brass lamp. Weather charts, wind measurements, handwritten notes in tight, precise script. Seren Vale had been organized. Extremely organized. Callan opened one of the notebooks. Inside were rows of data wind directions, rainfall totals, lake temperature measurements. Page after page, years of work. He leaned back in the chair, slowly. She wasn't hiding out here, he murmured. She was studying something. Merritt's nails clicked lightly against the wooden floor. The dog had moved toward the back door that led outside. Callan followed him. Beyond the door, the greenhouse shimmered beneath the sunlight. Glass panels reflected the sky in bright blue fragments. The structure was larger than it looked from a distance, almost the size of a small barn. Callan stepped onto the path that led to it. Merritt moved ahead, his tail low but steady. The greenhouse door creaked softly when Callan opened it. Warm air rolled out immediately. Inside, rows of growing plants filled the long room tomatoes, climbing thin wire supports. Herbs spreading across wooden beds, vines curling around overhead frames. Sunlight filtered through the curved glass roof, filling the space with soft green light. The air smelled rich with soil and leaves. Callan walked slowly between the rows. "This place is still alive," he said quietly. Merritt stopped suddenly. The German shepherd lowered his nose to the stone floor. Then he began sniffing with intense focus. Callan frowned. "What is it?" Merritt circled once, twice. Then he placed his paw firmly against a particular stone tile. Callan crouched beside the dog. The tile looked identical to every other tile in the greenhouse floor, but Merritt continued pawing at it with quiet determination. Scratch. Pause. Scratch again. Callan pressed his hand against the stone. It shifted slightly. He leaned back, surprised. "Well, I'll be—" With a careful push, the tile lifted just enough to reveal the edge of a small brass hatch ring embedded beneath it. Callan stared down at the hidden mechanism. Seren Vale had built something here, and she hadn't wanted it found easily. Merritt sat back beside him calmly, watching, waiting. Callan lifted the tile carefully. Beneath it was a square metal hatch set flush into the foundation floor. The metal was old, but well-maintained. A small keyhole rested beside the ring. Callan studied it silently. He could feel the faint, cool air rising through the edges of the hatch. Something lay beneath the greenhouse. He ran his hand across the surface thoughtfully, then shook his head. "Not yet." Merritt tilted his head slightly. Callan lowered the tile back into place. If Seren had hidden something down there, she probably intended it to be opened properly, not forced. Callan stood and brushed dust from his hands. "Let's see the rest of the place first." Merritt gave a quiet huff, but obeyed. The orchard behind the greenhouse sloped gently toward the lake. Callan walked through the rows of apple trees slowly. The leaves rustled softly in the breeze. Somewhere nearby, water lapped against the rocks below the cliff. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. Callan stopped near the edge of the slope. From here he could see the entire property. The house, the greenhouse, the tall wind tower behind it, and the long wooden dock stretching out into the lake. Whoever Seren Vale had been, she had built something remarkable here. Not just a house, a system, a place designed for work, study, observation. Callan felt something unexpected stir in his chest. Curiosity. Merritt moved beside him and sat quietly. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the greenhouse behind them. Callan followed the gaze. The wind rustled the vines along the glass roof. For a brief moment, the reflection of the sky shifted across the panels like moving water. Callan exhaled slowly. All right, he said. Let's figure out what you left behind, Saren. The lake wind carried the scent of pine and cold stone across the orchard, and Aurora House waited patiently around them. The morning light over Aurora House deepened as the sun climbed higher above Lake Superior. From the orchard slope, Callan Voss watched the surface of the lake change from dull silver to a clear, shifting blue. Wind moved across the water in long, dark ripples that stretched toward the horizon like brush strokes on glass. Merritt sat beside him in the grass. The German shepherd's ears twitched occasionally at distant sounds, the cry of a gull, the rustle of pine branches behind the greenhouse, but the dog remained calm. Callan took a slow breath. Aurora House felt peaceful. But peace didn't always mean safety. Years in the military had taught him that some of the quietest places hid the deepest trouble. He looked back toward the greenhouse. Sunlight shimmered across the curved glass roof, turning the structure into something almost beautiful from a distance. The vines climbing its metal frame stirred gently in the breeze. From here, nothing looked unusual. Yet Callan couldn't shake the feeling that Saren Vale had left something unfinished here. And unfinished things had a way of calling attention to themselves. "Come on," he said quietly. Merritt stood immediately. They walked back toward the greenhouse. Inside, the warm air wrapped around them again, thick with the scent of damp soil and growing plants. Callan moved slowly between the planting beds, studying the structure more carefully than before. The greenhouse wasn't improvised. It had been designed. Thick stone foundation walls supported the outer frame. Steel beams reinforced the curved glass roof, and a series of narrow vents ran along the upper ridge for ventilation. Everything about it suggested careful planning. Saren Vale hadn't built this place for decoration. She had built it to work. Callan walked toward the far end of the greenhouse, where shelves of gardening tools lined the wall. Shovels, metal watering cans, a set of pruning shears hung neatly on a hook. No dust. He ran his fingers across the wooden handle of a shovel. Recently cleaned. His eyes narrowed slightly. "That's odd," he murmured. Merritt had stopped moving. The dog stood near the back wall, nose low to the ground, sniffing slowly along the edge where the stone floor met the foundation. Callan watched the animal carefully. Merritt's posture changed when he discovered something unusual. Right now, the dog's tail was low and stiff. Focused. "Find something?" Merritt moved a few steps to the left, sniffed again, then turned and walked back toward the center of the greenhouse floor. Callan followed. The stone tiles beneath his boots looked identical to every other tile in the building. Except for one thing. Dust. Callan crouched down slowly. The floor near the planting beds had a thin layer of soil tracked from boots and gardening work. But the stone tiles closer to the center were cleaner. Too clean. Like someone had brushed the surface recently. Callan leaned closer. And then he saw it. A faint impression in the dust. The outline of a shoe. Large. Deep enough to show weight. And fresh enough that the edges hadn't softened yet. Callan's chest tightened slightly. "That wasn't me," he said quietly. Merritt looked up at him. Callan scanned the greenhouse slowly. The door behind them stood open. Sunlight spilled across the entrance. Outside, the orchard trees swayed gently, but inside the greenhouse, the air suddenly felt colder. He studied the footprint carefully. The tread pattern was heavy-work boots, not running shoes. The size suggested a man larger than average. The print angled toward the far corner of the greenhouse. Callan followed the direction with his eyes. The corner looked ordinary, just a row of empty planting beds and a stack of clay pots. But the dust near the wall told a different story. More faint marks. Someone had walked here. Not days ago, recently. Merritt padded quietly toward the corner and sniffed the clay pots one by one. Callan moved behind him. The prince stopped abruptly near the wall. No return path. Callan frowned. That doesn't make sense. Unless the person had left another way. He scanned the walls again. The stone foundation rose nearly 4 feet before the glass frame began. Solid. No doors. No windows. But then Callan noticed something small. Near the base of the wall, partly hidden behind stacked pots, was a narrow wooden panel. It blended almost perfectly with the stone behind it. Almost. Callan moved the pots aside carefully. The panel was about 2 feet wide. A simple iron latch held it closed. Callan studied the latch. Rust had formed along the edges, but the center of the metal was worn smooth. Used. Merritt sat down beside him quietly. Watching. Waiting. Callan lifted the latch slowly. The wooden panel creaked open. Behind it was a narrow concrete stairwell descending into darkness. Cold air drifted upward from below. Callan exhaled softly. Well, he said, looks like Seren liked secrets. Before Callan could step forward, Merritt suddenly froze. The German shepherd's ears snapped forward. His entire body stiffened. A low growl rolled quietly from his chest. Callan followed the dog's gaze into the stairwell. For a moment, he saw nothing. Just darkness. Then a faint sound echoed upward. Not loud. Not clear. But unmistakable. A small metallic shift. Like something settling deeper below. Callan's pulse slowed. Years of training pulled his mind into focus. Someone had been here. And maybe someone still was. Merritt glanced up at him. Callan rested a hand on the dog's neck. Easy, he whispered. Callan reached into his jacket and removed a small flashlight from the inside pocket. The beam cut cleanly through the darkness as he aimed it down the stairs. Concrete steps spiraled downward for about 15 feet before reaching a landing. The walls were reinforced with steel braces. This wasn't an improvised cellar. It had been built intentionally. Callan stepped onto the first stair. The sound echoed softly. Merritt followed without hesitation. At the bottom of the stairwell, the beam of the flashlight revealed a narrow corridor. Pipes ran along the ceiling. A thin layer of dust covered the concrete floor. Except for the footprints. Callan crouched again. The same tread pattern he had seen above. The prints moved deeper into the corridor. Merritt sniffed them carefully, then lifted his head. The dog's tail gave a small, uncertain flick. Callan understood the signal. The scent was fresh, but not minutes fresh. Hours. Whoever had been here had already gone. Still, the idea that someone had entered Aurora House before him unsettled him more than he expected. He moved slowly down the corridor. The flashlight beam revealed a reinforced steel door at the far end. Old, but solid. A faded metal plate beside the handle read, Hydrology Lab, Aurora Research Wing. Callan stopped. Hydrology. Water studies. He thought of the lake, the orchard, the greenhouse irrigation lines. Seren hadn't just been studying weather, she had been studying the land itself. Callan pushed the door open. The hinges groaned softly. Inside was a small laboratory space. Shelves of glass jars filled with soil samples lined the walls. Maps covered a long worktable detailed charts of underground water channels and geological layers beneath the cliffs of Blue Cedar. Callan stepped closer. He studied one map carefully. Lines drawn in blue ink traced the movement of groundwater through the bedrock beneath the region. The lines all converged in one place. Aurora House. Callan leaned over the table. "This property sits on the main aquifer," he whispered. The realization hit him slowly. Fresh water. Clean groundwater beneath the cliffs. One of the most valuable resources in the north. He thought about Rhett, about the marina, about land development rumors he had overheard years ago. Callan's jaw tightened. Merritt walked quietly around the lab, sniffing the equipment. The dog stopped near a metal filing cabinet. He nudged it gently with his nose. The cabinet shifted slightly. Callan stepped closer. Another secret? He pulled the drawer open. Inside were dozens of neatly organized folders, legal documents, land surveys, environmental reports, and one thin envelope placed at the very top. Callan opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph. An old one. The picture showed a younger Saren Vale standing beside a wind tower outside Aurora House. Next to her stood a tall teenage boy. Dark hair. Lean build. Callan stared. It was him. He looked barely 16. Standing awkwardly with a fishing rod in one hand. And beside him, a young German shepherd puppy. Callan's throat tightened. That's impossible. Merritt looked up at him quietly. Callan turned the photograph over. On the back, written in careful handwriting, were 3 simple words. The right heir. Callan stared at the words. The silence of the underground lab pressed in around him. Somewhere above them, wind moved through the apple trees. And for the first time since arriving at Aurora House, Callan understood something important. Saren Vale had not chosen him by accident. The morning after Callan discovered the underground research room, Lake Superior woke beneath a clear blue sky. Sunlight spilled across the water like scattered glass. The cold northern wind had softened overnight, leaving the surface of the lake calmer than it had been the day before. From the porch of Aurora House, Callan Voss watched the distant shoreline where the small town of Blue Cedar rested between dark pine forests and gray cliffs. Merritt lay beside the wooden steps, his large head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, but alert enough to track every movement of the birds overhead. Callan sipped from a dented metal mug filled with black coffee. His mind was still turning over what he had found beneath the greenhouse. The underground lab, the aquifer maps, the photograph. Saren Vale had known more about him than anyone in his own family, and someone else had already walked through Aurora House before he arrived. The thought lingered like a shadow behind his calm, but there was nothing more he could do about it this morning. The orchard rustled quietly in the breeze. Life went on. Callan set the mug down. "Come on, Merritt," he said. The German shepherd rose immediately, stretching his long legs before trotting down the slope beside him. Callan planned to drive into Blue Cedar. He needed supplies, tools, and answers if he could find them. Aurora House might hold secrets, but the town held history. Blue Cedar looked different in daylight. The small harbor town had grown slowly around the curve of the bay, a row of wooden buildings facing the water with docks stretching into the lake. Fishing boats rocked gently against the pilings, their ropes creaking in the breeze. People moved about the docks, preparing for the day. Some stopped when they noticed Callan walking down the gravel road toward the marina. Others simply watched. Small towns remembered faces. Callan hadn't lived here in years, but his return had already become a quiet topic of conversation. Merritt walked beside him calmly. the black harness with dark red trim visible against his thick fur. The dog drew attention wherever he went. Not fear. Curiosity. Near the harbor entrance stood a small bakery painted pale yellow with a wooden sign above the door that read Dorian's Kitchen. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the open window. Callan paused. Merritt's nose lifted immediately. The dog's tail wagged once. "Yeah," Callan murmured. "I smelled it too." Before he could step inside, the door opened. A woman emerged carrying a wooden tray of bread loaves. She nearly bumped into him. "Oh, sorry." Her voice was calm, but slightly surprised. She stepped back quickly, balancing the tray with practiced ease. This was May Dorian. She was in her mid-30s, about 5'8", with a strong, balanced posture that suggested years of physical work rather than delicate habits. Her dark chestnut hair was pulled into a loose braid that rested over one shoulder, strands escaping in the wind. Her skin held the healthy warmth of someone who spent time outdoors, and faint freckles dusted the bridge of her nose. Her eyes were a deep green-gray, steady and observant. She studied Callan for a moment. Then her gaze shifted to Merritt. "Well," she said softly, "that explains the dog everyone's talking about." Callan gave a small nod. Merritt. The German shepherd sat politely beside him. May crouched slightly, offering the back of her hand for the dog to sniff. Merritt examined her carefully before accepting the greeting. "You're Callan Voss," she said. It wasn't a question. Callan shrugged slightly. "Word travels fast." May stood again. "That's how towns like this work." She studied him more closely now. "You're the one who moved into Aurora House." Callan met her gaze evenly. "For now." May nodded slowly. "I used to see Sarenvale around town sometimes," she said. "Quiet woman, but people respected her. There was no judgment in her tone, only curiosity." She shifted the bread tray slightly. "You look like you could use breakfast." Callan hesitated. Then he gave a faint half-smile. "That obvious?" May tilted her head toward the bakery. "Coffee's fresh." Inside the bakery, the warmth felt almost startling after the cool lake air. Wooden tables filled the small room, and shelves behind the counter displayed rows of pastries and loaves. A radio played quietly near the kitchen door. May set the tray down and poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug. Callan sat near the window, while Merritt lay beside the table. A few customers glanced his way, but returned quickly to their conversations. May placed the mug in front of him. "So," she said, "you planning to stay at Aurora House?" Callan wrapped his hands around the mug. "Still deciding." May leaned against the counter. "You should know something." Her voice lowered slightly. "People around here worry about that land." Callan looked up. "Why?" May hesitated. Before she could answer, a sharp shout came from outside, then another. Callan turned toward the window. Down at the dock, several people were suddenly running toward the water. A boat alarm began blaring somewhere near the harbor. Merritt was on his feet instantly. The German shepherd's ears snapped forward. Callan stood. "What happened?" A fisherman rushed past the bakery door shouting, "Boat overturned near the rocks!" Callan's heart dropped. Lake Superior was beautiful, but it was also cold enough to kill within minutes. He ran. Merritt kept pace beside him, paws striking the gravel with silent precision. At the end of the dock, a crowd had gathered. Two small figures struggled in the water near a rocky outcrop 50 yards from shore. A fishing skiff floated upside down nearby. Someone shouted, "Kids!" Another man yelled for ropes, but no one moved closer. The water was too cold, Callan didn't hesitate. He kicked off his boots and jacket. "Stay back," he ordered. Years of command sharpened his voice automatically. Merritt barked once, and then the dog leapt into the water beside him. The cold hit like a hammer. Lake Superior swallowed the heat from Callan's body instantly, but Merritt cut through the water ahead of him with powerful strokes, already heading toward the struggling children. Callan reached the overturned skiff first. A small girl clung to the hull, shivering violently. Her brother floated nearby, barely keeping his head above water. Callan grabbed the boy's jacket and pulled him toward the boat. "Hold on!" Merritt swam past them, and suddenly stopped. The German shepherd circled once in the water, nose down, scanning beneath the surface. Then he barked sharply. Callan followed the dog's gaze. Something else was moving below the waterline. Not a person, not a fish. A rope, wrapped around the propeller of the overturned boat. The same rope that had dragged the children under when the engine stalled. Merritt had seen it, before anyone else. Callan kicked toward the propeller and reached beneath the water. The rope tightened around his wrist for a moment before he tore it free from the metal blades. The tension released instantly. The skiff shifted. Callan pushed the children toward the boat hull. "Grab it!" Both kids obeyed, clinging to the edge. Merritt circled them protectively. From the dock, someone finally threw a rope. Callan secured it around the skiff. "Pull!" The crowd hauled the boat slowly toward shore. By the time they reached the dock, the children were shaking but alive. The older boy coughed water violently. The girl clung to Callan's arm. May pushed through the crowd, kneeling beside them. Her movements were quick and efficient. "You two breathe slowly," she told the children gently. Callan realized something then. May had the calm hands of someone trained for emergencies. She looked up at him briefly. "I used to run lake rescues here," she said. "Before the bakery." Callan nodded. That explained the confidence. Merritt climbed onto the dock, water dripping from his thick coat. The dog shook himself violently, spraying half the crowd. Someone laughed nervously. The tension broke. One of the fishermen clapped Callan on the shoulder. "Didn't think anyone would jump in that fast." Callan shrugged. "Habit." The boy who had nearly drowned stared at Merritt. "That dog saved us." Callan looked down. Merritt stood tall, ears relaxed now, tail swaying slightly. The dog looked perfectly content, as if this had been just another task. Later, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Callan sat on the edge of the dock with Merritt beside him. The afternoon sun warmed the wooden boards. May walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Callan. "You just changed a lot of minds today," she said quietly. Callan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" May glanced toward the town. "People thought you came back for money." She nodded toward the dog. "But men who jump into Lake Superior for strangers usually aren't here for that." Callan took a slow sip of coffee. He looked out across the water again. The lake stretched endless and bright beneath the sky. Merritt rested his head against Callan's knee. For the first time since returning to Blue Cedar, Callan felt something shift. Not acceptance. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of it. Late afternoon light settled gently over Aurora House when Callan returned from Blue Cedar. The rescue on the lake had left the smell of cold water and wood smoke lingering in his clothes, but something deeper lingered as well. A quiet shift in the way the town had looked at him when he walked back along the dock. Not suspicion. Something closer to recognition. Callan parked the truck beside the gravel path and stepped out slowly. The wind had picked up slightly since morning, carrying the crisp scent of pine and lake water across the orchard. Merritt jumped down beside him. The German Shepherd's thick, cream-gray-black coat had mostly dried after the swim, though the fur along his chest still curled slightly from the earlier soaking. The dog stretched once, front legs long and powerful, then shook his head with a quiet huff. Callan scratched behind the dog's ear. "You handled that pretty well today." Merritt's tail thumped lightly against the truck tire. The dog had always been steady in chaos. That calm had saved Callan more than once in the past. Now, standing beneath the fading sky, Aurora House felt different from when he first arrived. Not mysterious, not threatening, more like a place beginning to reveal its intentions. Callan walked through the orchard slowly. The apple trees cast long shadows across the ground. Small green fruit hung from the branches, not yet ripe, but already filling the air with a faint, sweet scent. The greenhouse stood quietly near the house, its glass roof glowing amber in the lowering sun, but Callan's eyes drifted beyond it, toward the tall metal structure rising behind the property. The Wind Observation Tower. Seren Vale's tower. He had noticed it the day before, but hadn't climbed it yet. Something about it had felt deliberate. "Let's take a look," he said. Merritt followed immediately. The tower stood nearly 50 feet tall, built from steel beams bolted together in a narrow triangular frame. A spiral ladder climbed its center toward a small platform near the top, where wind sensors and old measuring equipment still hung. The structure creaked softly in the wind. Callan ran a hand along one of the support beams. The metal was weathered but solid. Seren Vale had built things to last. At the base of the tower stood a narrow wooden shed. Callan opened the door. Inside were boxes of tools, notebooks, and mechanical parts equipment used for maintaining weather instruments. The room smelled faintly of oil and metal. Merritt sniffed along the edges of the shed carefully. Callan examined the shelves. Most of the equipment had been packed neatly, but one item stood out: a small projector. Old but functional. Beside it lay a sealed envelope and a portable hard drive. Callan picked up the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. Seren Vale. His chest tightened slightly. "She really expected someone to come looking," he murmured. Merritt sat beside him, watching quietly. Callan opened the envelope. Inside was a short letter. "Callan, if you are standing at the tower, then you have already seen enough to know Aurora House was never just a home. Everything you need to understand what this place protects is here. The tower watches the wind, but the land beneath it watches something far more important. Trust what you find." Seren Callan turned the letter over slowly. The words were calm, deliberate, not the message of someone hiding from the world. More like the instructions of someone preparing for a future confrontation. He connected the projector to a small battery pack nearby. The machine hummed quietly as it powered on. A few seconds later, the projector flickered to life against the white wall of the shed. Grainy footage filled the surface. Seren Vale appeared on screen. She looked younger than Callan had expected, perhaps in her late 50s when the recording was made. Her silver hair was tied back neatly, and her face carried the quiet focus of someone used to thinking several steps ahead of everyone else. She wore a thick gray sweater and stood in front of the greenhouse. "Hello, Callan," she said. Her voice was steady. "If you're watching this, then my timing worked." Callan leaned against the workbench. Merritt watched the moving image with quiet curiosity. Seren continued. "For years, Aurora House has protected something beneath this land that many people would destroy if they understood its value." The image shifted to maps projected beside her. Blue lines spread across the screen. Groundwater. Aquifers. Callan's stomach tightened. Saren pointed to a large underground reservoir marked directly beneath the property. This aquifer supplies most of the clean water along this section of Lake Superior's northern shore. Callan exhaled slowly. He already suspected something like that, but hearing it confirmed made the situation far heavier. Saren's voice grew quieter. Some people believe this water should belong to corporations willing to pay for it. Callan immediately thought of Rhett and the marina expansion rumors. Saren looked directly into the camera. I built Aurora House to protect it. The projector flickered suddenly. The image shifted briefly to another recording. Saren stood beside the wind tower this time. Behind her was a younger Callan, perhaps 17, leaning awkwardly against the railing with a fishing pole in his hands. The same moment captured in the photograph he had found earlier. Saren looked at the camera and smiled faintly. You don't know it yet, Callan, she said softly, but you're the only one stubborn enough to keep this place alive. The recording paused. The image froze. Callan stared at the screen. He didn't remember this day. Not clearly. But the weight of her words pressed against him now like something inevitable. Merritt nudged his hand gently, as if confirming the moment. The projector resumed the main recording. Saren now stood beside a table covered with documents. You'll find legal files stored throughout Aurora House, she said. They explain the creation of a trust I established decades ago. Callan straightened slightly. Saren continued. The Aurora North Trust. She lifted a folder. This trust holds the financial resources necessary to preserve this land, protect the aquifer, and support environmental recovery projects across the region. Callan frowned. Financial resources, he murmured. Saren opened the folder in the recording. Rows of numbers filled the page. Endowments, investments, land purchases. The total value appeared briefly on screen. Hundreds of millions. Callan blinked slowly. That can't be real. Merritt watched him carefully. Saren's voice grew softer. The trust is locked through multiple legal safeguards. Anyone attempting to seize Aurora House without fulfilling its conditions will find the entire structure impossible to control. Callan crossed his arms. Saren had anticipated everything, but the video hadn't finished. She leaned slightly closer to the camera. And Callan, her expression changed. Not stern, not formal, almost kind. You were never meant to inherit this because of blood. You inherited it because you know what it means to fight for something that doesn't belong to you alone. The recording faded. The projector clicked softly as the reel ended. The shed fell silent. Outside, wind brushed through the orchard again. Callan stood there for a long moment. Processing. Merritt shifted beside him. The dog walked toward the back wall of the shed. His nose lowered. Then he scratched once against the wooden boards. Callan followed. Another one? Behind the wall panel was a narrow compartment. Inside sat a locked metal case. The engraved label on the lid read, Aurora North Trust. Master Archive. Callan stared at it. The sun dipped lower outside, casting long shadows through the shed doorway. Merritt sat calmly beside the case, watching him. Callan rested his hand on the cold metal lid. Saren Vale hadn't just left him a house. She had left him a responsibility, and judging by the things he had already discovered, there were people who would fight to take it. Callan closed the case again. Not tonight, he said quietly. The wind tower creaked above them, and somewhere beyond the orchard, Lake Superior rolled endlessly against the shore. Morning arrived slowly over Aurora House. Low clouds drifted across the pale sky, softening the sunlight into a cool gray glow that settled over the orchard and the lake beyond. Wind moved through the apple trees with a steady hush, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles across the hillside. Callan Voss stood on the porch with a mug of coffee warming his hands. Merritt lay beside the wooden steps, head lifted, ears twitching occasionally as he tracked distant sounds along the forest line. The night had given Callan time to think. Saren Vale's recording still echoed in his mind. The aquifer, the trust, the responsibility. He had faced dangerous missions before. But protecting land from powerful people with money and influence was a different kind of battle. Slower, quieter, and sometimes more ruthless. Callan took a sip of coffee and stared out across the lake. "Looks like she signed us up for something big," he murmured. Merritt gave a quiet rumble of acknowledgement. The dog understood tone, if not words. Callan stepped down from the porch. He planned to return to the tower shed and examine the metal archive case more carefully. But he stopped halfway across the orchard. A black SUV was parked near the gravel road. He hadn't heard it arrive. Merritt had. The German Shepherd was already on his feet. The dog's posture had changed instantly, alert, controlled, protective. The vehicle door opened. A tall man stepped out. The stranger moved with the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went. He was in his early 40s, perhaps a few years older than Callan. His height matched Callan's, but his build was broader, carrying the heavy shoulders of someone who had spent years working physical jobs before trading them for a more comfortable life. His dark hair was trimmed neatly but not styled, and a thick beard framed his jaw. The beard was streaked slightly with gray near the chin, giving him the look of a man who had aged quickly from long days and difficult decisions. His name was Grant Halbrook, Rhett Halbrook's older brother. Unlike Rhett's polished arrogance, Grant carried a quieter kind of presence. His movements were calm, almost careful, as if he had learned to avoid unnecessary conflict, but his eyes, deep brown and observant, revealed a sharp intelligence behind the calm. He looked around Aurora House slowly. "Nice place," he said. Callan didn't answer. Merritt remained perfectly still beside him. Grant lifted both hands slightly. "I didn't come to cause trouble." Callan crossed his arms. "Then you picked the wrong family to represent." Grant smiled faintly. "Fair point." He stepped closer, but kept a respectful distance. "Rhett wanted to come himself," Grant continued. "But I suggested that might complicate things." Callan studied him carefully. Grant Halbrook was known in Blue Cedar as the practical one, the brother who handled construction contracts and land negotiations for the Halbrook Marina. Not cruel, but not harmless either. "What do you want?" Callan asked. Grant glanced briefly at the greenhouse, the wind tower, the orchard. Then back at Callan. "To make you an offer." They sat at the wooden table outside the house. Merritt remained beside Callan's chair, eyes locked on the visitor. Grant placed a folder on the table and slid it across. "Before you say anything," he said calmly, "you should at least hear the numbers." Callan didn't touch the folder. Grant opened it himself. Inside were land purchase agreements and corporate documents. "The Halbrook Development Group plans to expand the marina," Grant explained. "Tourism, shipping, recreation. Blue Cedar would triple its economy within 5 years." Callan watched him silently. Grant tapped the final page. "The land around Aurora House is critical to that expansion." Callan already knew where this was going. Grant leaned back slightly. "We're prepared to buy the entire property." Callan raised an eyebrow. "How generous." Grant's tone remained calm. 200 million? The wind rustled through the orchard again. Callan stared at him for a moment. $200 million. It was the kind of number that would change most people's lives instantly. Grant watched his reaction carefully. We know Seren left you the property unexpectedly, he continued. Handling land like this isn't easy. The trust structures, environmental regulations, it's a headache waiting to happen. He pushed the folder closer. You could walk away today with enough money to start any life you want. Callan finally placed his hand on the folder, but he didn't open it. Tell Rhett something for me, he said quietly. Grant waited. Callan slid the folder back across the table. I didn't come back to Blue Cedar looking for an exit. Grant studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I expected that answer. Before Grant could stand, Merritt suddenly rose. The German shepherd's ears snapped forward. The dog turned toward the forest behind the wind tower. A low growl rolled quietly from his chest. Callan followed the dog's gaze. At the edge of the trees, something moved. Just a flash of color between the trunks. Red, then gone. Grant frowned. You expecting someone else? Callan shook his head slowly. Merritt took 2 cautious steps toward the trees, then stopped. The dog's posture shifted again, uncertain now rather than aggressive. Whatever had been there was already gone. Grant stood. Looks like your dog has good instincts, he said. Callan didn't respond. Grant closed the folder and tucked it under his arm. I'll be honest with you, he said quietly. Rhett isn't going to give up on this land. Callan leaned back in his chair. Neither am I. Grant nodded again, but this time there was something heavier in his expression. Then things are going to get complicated. He walked toward the SUV. Before climbing inside, he paused. One more thing, he added. You might want to check the county registry. Callan frowned. For what? Grant opened the driver's door. For the second will. Callan's eyes narrowed. What second will? Grant only shrugged. The one Seren filed 3 weeks before she died. And with that, he drove away. The orchard fell silent again. Callan remained seated at the table, watching the empty road. Merritt returned slowly and sat beside him. The dog's tail rested against the wooden boards. Callan rubbed the back of his neck. Second will, he muttered. Seren Vale had already left him the house. The trust. The research. What else could she possibly have changed? Callan stood and walked toward the wind tower again. The metal archive case remained hidden inside the shed. Whatever answers existed, they were probably inside that box. Merritt followed him quietly. Above them, the wind instruments creaked softly against the sky, and somewhere in the forest beyond the orchard, something unseen continued to watch Aurora House. Morning arrived with a colder wind than the day before. Clouds rolled low across the sky above Aurora House, their pale gray undersides dragging slow shadows across the orchard and the lake beyond. The surface of Lake Superior shifted restlessly beneath the wind, waves folding over each other in quiet lines that whispered against the rocky shoreline below the cliffs. Callan Voss stood near the wind tower, hands buried in the pockets of his worn olive-gray tactical shirt. The words Grant Halbrook had spoken the day before still lingered in his mind. The second will. Seren Vale had already left him the house, the trust, the responsibility. So what else had she changed? Merritt stood beside him, watching the edge of the forest with the calm vigilance of a soldier who had learned to trust his senses more than silence. Callan studied the wind tower slowly. The metal structure creaked softly overhead, as the instruments turned with the breeze. The shed at its base waited quietly beneath the frame. Inside that shed sat the metal archive case Saren had hidden. Callan took a slow breath. "Guess we're opening it today," he said. Merritt's tail flicked once. The shed door groaned as Callan pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper, machine oil, and dry wood. The projector from the previous night still sat on the workbench, its cables loosely coiled beside it. The metal case rested where Callan had left it, a dull gray box about the size of a small suitcase. The engraved label on the lid read, Aurora North Trust. Master Archive. Callan crouched beside it. The lock mechanism wasn't complex, but it wasn't decorative either. Saren Vale had designed this container to be opened deliberately, not by accident. Callan examined the latch carefully. Merritt sat nearby, watching the door of the shed rather than the box, always guarding. Callan lifted the lid. The hinges opened with a soft, metallic click. Inside lay several thick folders, sealed envelopes, and a compact digital storage drive. Callan picked up the top folder. The words printed across the front read, Legal Directive, Revised Estate Filing. He opened it slowly. The first page contained a familiar heading. Saren Vale, Estate Amendment, dated 3 weeks before her death. Callan leaned against the workbench as he read. The document confirmed something important. Saren's original will had indeed transferred Aurora House to him, but the amendment added something new, a clause, one that restructured ownership of the property entirely. Callan read the paragraph twice, then a third time. "This can't be right," he murmured. Merritt tilted his head slightly. Callan exhaled slowly. Saren hadn't simply given him Aurora House. She had placed the property under the control of the Aurora North Trust immediately upon his acceptance, which meant the land no longer belonged to him personally. It belonged to the trust, and Callan stared at the final line of the document. He was merely the guardian. He sat down heavily on the wooden stool beside the bench. The wind rattled softly against the metal walls of the tower outside. Callan rubbed his face with one hand. "So that's the game." The trust structure explained everything. If Halbrook Development tried to purchase the land, they wouldn't be negotiating with Callan. They would be negotiating with a legal entity designed specifically to prevent the land from being sold. Saren had anticipated the pressure. Every bit of it. Callan flipped through the remaining documents. Environmental protections, water rights, federal preservation filings. Every piece reinforced the same thing. Aurora House and the aquifer beneath it could not be sold. Not without violating the trust. Callan almost laughed. "Rhett's not going to like that." Merritt rose suddenly. The dog walked to the open shed door and stared outside. Callan glanced up. "What is it?" Merritt didn't bark. He simply watched the orchard, waiting. Callan followed his gaze. The wind moved through the apple trees in steady waves. Nothing unusual. Still, Callan felt the same strange tension he had felt the day before, like someone nearby was listening. Callan returned to the documents and reached for the final sealed envelope inside the case. The paper felt heavier than the others. His name was written across the front. Not typed. Handwritten. Callan opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet. A letter. Saren Vale's handwriting moved across the page in calm, precise strokes. Callan, if you have opened the archive, then you now understand the truth. Aurora House was never meant to be inherited. It was meant to be protected. The trust will keep the land safe from corporations and investors, but legal structures are not enough. There will always be people who believe ownership is stronger than responsibility. You will face them. And when that happens, remember this. The land chose its guardian long before the papers were written. Callan lowered the letter slowly. Something in Seren's words felt less like legal instruction, and more like quiet faith. Merritt nudged his hand gently. Callan placed the documents back into the metal case. He didn't lock it. Not yet. He stepped outside the shed and looked across the property. Aurora House stood peacefully against the hillside. The greenhouse glowed faintly beneath the gray sky. The orchard moved softly in the wind. And beyond it all, Lake Superior stretched endlessly into the horizon. For the first time since returning to Blue Cedar, Callan understood exactly what Seren had given him. Not money. Not land. A responsibility. The kind that didn't end with signatures or contracts. Merritt stood beside him, watching the trees. Callan scratched the dog's neck thoughtfully. You think we're ready for this? Merritt's tail wagged once. A simple answer. Callan looked toward the distant road where Grant Halbrook's SUV had disappeared the day before. The Halbrooks would return. He knew that. People chasing power rarely stopped after one refusal. But the trust had changed the battlefield. Now it wasn't just Callan standing between them and the land. It was the law. And Seren Vale's careful planning. Callan lifted the metal case and carried it back toward the house. Inside Aurora House, the quiet rooms waited beneath the high windows. The wind tower creaked softly behind him. And somewhere beneath the orchard, deep below the roots of the apple trees, fresh water flowed silently through the rock. Protected. For now. Before we end this story, there is something worth remembering. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through a loyal dog, a forgotten letter, a piece of land, or a moment when a person chooses to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. In this story, Callan believed he had returned to Blue Cedar by accident. But step by step, it became clear that nothing about his journey was random. A path had been prepared long before he understood it. The house, the land, the responsibility, even the dog who stood beside him through everything. All of it formed a quiet reminder that God often works through ordinary moments to guide people toward the place they are meant to stand. Many of us walk through life believing we are alone in our struggles. We face difficult choices, unfair treatment, or seasons where nothing seems to make sense. But faith teaches us something different. Even when the road feels uncertain, there may be a purpose unfolding that we cannot yet see. Sometimes the challenge in front of us is not meant to break us. It is meant to shape us into the person who can protect something greater than ourselves. Just like Callan, we may not always understand why certain doors close or why certain paths suddenly appear. But when we keep moving forward with integrity, courage, and compassion, we often discover that those moments were not accidents at all. They were part of a plan that was quietly guiding us. In our everyday lives, miracles rarely look dramatic. They look like a stranger helping someone in need. They look like a loyal companion standing beside us. They look like the strength to choose kindness instead of anger, patience instead of bitterness, and faith instead of fear. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on the small blessings in your own life. Sometimes the miracle you are waiting for is already happening around you, in ways you may not yet recognize. If you believe that God works through ordinary people and everyday moments, share this message with someone who might need a little encouragement today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what part of this story spoke to you the most. Your words might inspire someone else who is going through a difficult season right now. And if you enjoy stories about faith, courage, loyalty, and the quiet miracles that shape our lives, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next story. May God watch over you and your family. May He guide your steps, strengthen your heart, and protect you in the days ahead. Thank you for being here, and may peace walk with you wherever your journey leads.